What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, November 12th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. 8-game NBA slate tonight. Really good size slate. Some injury news that we are still waiting on, particularly Jason Tatum obviously has a potential to really throw a wrench into things. But overall, pretty fun slate. Also a big $888 tournament on DraftKings tonight. $250,000 to first there. So that looks pretty fun if you're playing that. But going to walk through my player exposures if the slate started right now for the large field. I think tonight it's a $5 $100K to first tournament on DraftKings. Going to go game by game and look at the players I'm getting to walk through the games that way. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in chat and I will give you my thoughts if I have them on whoever you ask about. But going to go through which players I'm getting to right now. Obviously, a lot of stuff going to change between now and lock. It pretty much always will. Ownership changes. Typically, there's going to be injury news that changes things as well. So definitely wouldn't take anything on this show as gospel, but more so just my thoughts on tournaments, how I approach them in general. Hopefully you can take some things away from that. And then there will be some individual player takes that do stand between now and lock as well. So starting off with Miami taking on Detroit, relatively low total here, close spread. And I am not getting to too much in this game. Bam Adebayo showing up in about 21% of my 150 lineups, projected for about 18% ownership. Nothing real crazy there. $8,000 price tag. Pretty good matchup against Detroit. We did just get news on the Detroit side that Jalen Duren and Isaiah Stewart are both in, but Bam still looks pretty good here. 21% of my lineups, 18% projected ownership. Miami tonight is without Jimmy Butler, so you do have a little bit higher ceiling for Bam than you typically would. Whether or not that ends up meaning actual production, obviously, is anybody's guess, because you can always make the argument that not having Butler out there just makes the offense in general not as efficient, not as dangerous. You can focus on Bam more, but does increase the ceiling just not having to contend with Jimmy Butler taking shots. Last season, 22 games played with no Jimmy Butler, 1.28 DraftKings points per minute in 36 minutes per game. So overall, does look pretty good there. Happy to be getting to him. Getting to a little bit of Terry Rozier at 6,100 as well. 6% projected ownership. Should also theoretically see a bump with no Jimmy Butler. Pretty good price tag. I do expect him to take a backseat to Adebayo and Hero, but the price tag is nice and there is still some upside there. I'm not getting the much Hero, which I wish I were getting more just because he is obviously a high upside player and you are taking Jimmy Butler's usage away, which does mean that you could see more here from Tyler Hero. But there are also a lot of good guard plays on this slate. There are a lot of good mid-range plays on this slate in general. So not too concerned that I'm not getting the Hero. 1.1 DraftKings points per minute without Jimmy Butler last season. Clearly, this is just one of those plays where there's no set reason that I'm not getting the Hero. It's not that I think he's a bad play. I wouldn't tell anybody not to play him. If you like him, he's a perfectly good play. He's just not one that is really showing up much for me personally right now, and certainly could change between now and lock. For Detroit, on that side, as I mentioned, Jalen Duren and Isaiah Stewart are both in. Not much ownership coming into this team. I'm not getting to much of them either. Jaden Ivey, the only guy that I have here in double digits at about 11%. Fields getting to 8%. $6,200 price tag is very reasonable. There is upside for him. You're probably getting 34, 35 minutes or so, assuming that this game is competitive. Not a particularly appealing matchup here, but decent player, decent price tag. Perfectly fine getting around the field there. And then just kind of mixing in a little bit of Harris, Beasley, Cunningham, Hardaway. Obviously, Cade Cunningham gives you a really high ceiling. 8,900, relatively expensive, especially in the context of this slate. Nothing that really stands out here for me from the Detroit side, other than just mentioning that Jaden Ivey is pretty cheap at 6,200. Moving over to the Charlotte and Orlando game, really tough, unappealing spot for Charlotte, but I am still getting to LaMelo as a contrarian play here. I don't like the matchup at all. Orlando is a very good defensive team. They have not played at a fast pace this season, but there is clearly a ceiling for LaMelo. He's not cheap either at 9,600. You have a good individual on-ball defender in Jalen Suggs on the Magic. You have KCP, who can also switch on to LaMelo and make life difficult. So this isn't a matchup-based thing. If you saw my show with covers using the EV Analytics prop betting tool this morning, I have the under on LaMelo 28.5 points, but it just kind of reinforces that whether you're talking about betting, whether you're talking about DFS, you are not really looking at it through the lens of I think this is a good spot. I think he's super likely to succeed or not succeed or whatever it may be. It's more so looking at it, how do I get paid off well? Is the reward worth the risk? And right now, with LaMelo projected at 7 or 8% ownership in DFS, I think you kind of can look at the positives. When I was talking about LaMelo taking the under on LaMelo this morning, I pointed out that he has a 38% usage rate this year. That probably comes back down into like the 33, 34% range over a larger sample. His 3-point percentage this year is up from previous seasons. More likely than not, it comes back down, but it may not. And so when I was talking about it in the betting lens, it was basically, I think from a median standpoint, there's value in betting the under. But here, where you're getting him at low ownership, you still have a guy that has a 38% usage rate this year and is taking more 3-point attempts and making them at a higher rate. Maybe he has just improved and, the ceiling is really high. So it's not that I think he's super likely to do well here. The matchup sucks. The price isn't particularly appealing, but you're still getting LaMelo Ball at sub 10% ownership on an 8-game slate. So that's getting him into some lineups for me. And while I don't feel great about it, certainly there are worse guys that you could be getting to. Brandon Miller showing up in like one lineup for me right now. 10% projected ownership to him. I think he's fine at 6,600. Again, it is a tough matchup against Orlando. He does have favorable positional eligibility with shooting guard and small forward. Has about a 25% usage rate so far this season. Second highest usage rate on the team behind LaMelo. So I think he's perfectly fine. We've seen big games from him already this year. I don't mind going back to him, but I'm personally just not really getting there. On the Orlando side, Goga Bitadze should be getting the start at center. He's in 23% of my lineups, Fields at 25%. Just still a pretty good price tag for him at $5,300. I'm happy to get there. I'm getting around 9 to 10% of Franz Wagner, which is a little bit below the field, but he does have an elevated ceiling with no Paolo Banchero. He should play more minutes without him as well. Going forward, 8,400, though, I think pretty much corrects for Banchero being out. I wouldn't expect Wagner to get that much more expensive going forward, so I don't really think that he's underpriced here. I think he just looks fine. Mo Wagner as the backup to Bitadze, good point per minute guy. I typically am willing to play backup centers that are good point per minute guys in large field tournaments as long as they are low owned. 5%, 6% ownership coming into Wagner. I'm getting, right around there. He's certainly not a guy that I want to be slamming into lineups, but if Bitadze gets in foul trouble or Wagner just plays really well and stays on the floor, like for whatever minutes he's on the floor, you can expect him to produce, which is nice. And then kind of just mixing and matching KCP, Jonathan Isaac, Jalen Suggs. But to me, Goga the priority here, followed by Franz Wagner. Atlanta taking on Boston. 15-point spread in this one. Jason Tatum is questionable for the Celtics. So this has the potential to look completely different by the time we get to lock. Al Horford also questionable. Jaden Springer questionable, which is clearly less important than those other two. But the injury news in this game that we do already know, the big injury news, not only is DeAndre Hunter out once again, Trae Young is out for the Hawks. So we don't have a starting lineup here, but it's likely that you get Keaton Wallace in the starting lineup at $3,200. They just don't really have that many other options. Bogdanovich is still out, so it clearly won't be him. So Keaton Wallace, I think, is in some ways like a horrible play here. He's averaged 0.85 DraftKings points per minute this season, but he's shooting 46% from three in 110 minutes played. He is just shooting incredibly well, and it's not going to continue. He projects for around 0.6 fantasy points per minute. So on the one hand, at massive ownership, I could make the case for just building lineups that don't use him and hoping that he does just waste a roster spot for everybody, and score like 18 points or something. But as you can see on the screen, that's not the direction that I'm likely to be going. He's in 94% of the lineups I have right now, just because the value is so good at 3,200. He's likely to play a ton of minutes just because the Hawks don't really have other options. He could certainly be on the floor in garbage time as well. There's no real reason that he wouldn't be. So it kind of is just that he's opening other things up, and that is getting him into lineups, even at high projected ownership and a very, very modest projection. So yeah, like it's not a good matchup, obviously, but Giannis is in a really good spot. He's expensive. You have, kind of upper mid-range guys like Devin Booker that you're going to want to get to. In my case, we just saw that I'm getting to LaMelo. Wallace is opening that up a bit. So not an exciting play, but he should be out there for enough minutes and cheap enough that I'm still getting there. Dyson Daniels is interesting to me. 10% ownership, 6K, 25% projected, or in 25% of my lineups, rather. He is somebody that I think you could see take on a bigger role without Trae Young. We obviously don't have much of a sample this year without Young on the floor, but there are limited ball handlers, playmakers on this team. Jalen Johnson is second on the team in potential assists behind Trae Young this year. In the limited time that Young hasn't been on the floor, we see a very elevated assist percentage for Jalen Johnson. But Dyson Daniels is third in potential assists, and we could see him take on a bigger role as well. Reasonably priced at 6K, should play a lot of minutes if this game's competitive, which obviously is a very big if. But at modest ownership, I like getting there. Reese, I don't love, but again, I get it, especially with him only being projected for like 2% ownership. If this ownership number does come up, I think I start to lose him because he's not necessarily somebody that I expect to step up and really produce at a lot higher level without Trae Young. He's not somebody I'm expecting to create and play make and get a bunch of assists. His potential assists this season rank between Larry Nance and Onyeka Okongwu on Atlanta, and he's playing more minutes per game than both of those guys. So it speaks to how limited he has been as a playmaker so far this season. He's not one of the guys that I really expect to step up and fill that role with Young out. I expect that to be Keaton Wallace, Dyson Daniels, and Jalen Johnson. But there is potentially more usage available. What he does with that against the Celtics, who knows? But at very low ownership and a cheap price tag, I don't mind getting to him. If that ownership does come up, though, I think he kind of just comes back. Like if this were to get to 10% ownership, I probably just end up with like 10%. It's certainly not a play that I'm excited about, but I think this ownership projection is just too low as is. $3,700 Garrison Matthews, 9% projected ownership. I'm a little above the field there. We'll see later that the player in this price range that is getting a lot of ownership is Grayson Allen on Phoenix. I think he's a good play. I'll talk about that more, but I am a little bit below the field on Allen, a little bit above the field on Matthews. Still have more Allen than Matthews, but Matthews, I think, is a very reasonable pivot in lineups where you do need to save some ownership and you don't want to take on a 40 to 50% owned Grayson Allen as a value play. Garrison Matthews, I think, can be the pivot there. And then I mentioned it a second ago with Jalen Johnson. He's the guy that I'm most confident in stepping up from a role standpoint with no Trae Young. We know that he's very good. We know that he can take on a bigger workload as a scorer, and we've seen him as the number 2 playmaker on the team already this year, and we've seen a bump in assist percentage with no Trae Young on the floor. The two problems here are, one, he's facing the Celtics, and two, he's already $8,600. So you're not getting a ton of, much of a discount on him. I'm getting right around the field at 12%. So very high ceiling for him, but I think you are paying for it at $8,600. But pretty scary amount of Hawks coming in, given that they have like a 103 team total, and the Celtics are probably going to beat the shit out of them. But the pricing for the most part, I think, is pretty favorable. Keaton Wallace, again, at least right now, I'm kind of just eating it. If Jason Tatum were to get ruled out, obviously this game becomes a little bit less likely to be a blowout, but also it would open up maybe a little bit more value on the Boston side that could lower the Keaton Wallace exposure. But I still don't think it would open up anything that's like dirt cheap, because you're still going to have most of the Celtics in, I assume. And it's not, and guys like Peyton Pritchard are already relatively expensive. So I don't think it's going to really give you a direct replacement to Keaton Wallace or anything like that. On the Boston side right now, with Jason Tatum projected in, getting about 2x the field on a $5,300 Drew Holiday. That price tag is plummeting. He really hasn't done a whole lot this year. Playing time has been down, but we know he's a productive DFS player. He can be. If Tatum is out, you do get potentially some more production from him as well. But it is a pretty good spot here going up against Atlanta. Fast-paced team, doesn't play defense, and you're just getting essentially a floor price tag at low ownership on Drew Holiday. I am willing to just kind of bet on the player here and not worry as much about, what he's done so far this year. You go back to the start of last season, 0.88 DraftKings points per minute. Obviously, there is blowout risk here that could limit him a bit. So far this year, 0.8 DraftKings points per minute. But I think the price tag and lack of ownership kind of just mitigates most of those concerns. Jaylen Brown at 8,200, perfectly fine play that I'm not really getting much of. Obviously, he is going to look better if Jason Tatum is out. He already has the potential here and there to be the number one option in this offense. We see that kind of go back and forth between him and Tatum, at least historically. Tatum obviously having a very good start to this year, but if Tatum is out, Brown goes from a secondary option that I think looks perfectly fine to a really big priority on this slate. That would be one of the biggest changes that we could have, I think, between now and lock. Outside of that, not really getting too much on the Celtics. But again, if Tatum were to be out, then these other secondary pieces do start to look better. Knicks taking on the Sixers in Philadelphia. Karl Anthony Towns has been taking more threes this year. less threes this year, rebounding better this year. But he has been scoring a lot recently. We've seen very big games from him. Foul risk going up against Joel Embiid here, but getting the 14% of him at center, 8,700, just a very high price or very high ceiling rather for Towns at a moderate price tag. Not going crazy one way or the other. I just think he's a pretty solid play. Don't really see anything else from the Knicks. 8%, Josh Hart. I'm getting to 6%. You know that these guys are going to play big minutes. It's Tibbs. We've already seen him cut his rotation down early in the season and really run these guys into the ground. Prices have adjusted a bit to where I don't think there's a ton of value here. 0.96 DraftKings points per minute for Josh Hart so far this season. He's played the second most minutes on the team, just ahead of OG Anunoby and just behind Mikal Bridges. Karl Anthony Towns, by the way, 1.43 DraftKings points per minute. So they both look fine. I think the field's pretty much got it correct on them. Field is not really getting too much of anybody else. For the Sixers, I have nothing. The field has nothing. Jared McCain projected for the most ownership here at 1%. Joel Embiid getting 1% at 10-4. So pretty much just a stay away from me here with Embiid back. You don't have Maxey, but prices are pretty high here. 7,300 for Oubre, 8,500 for George, 10-4 for Embiid. Lowry's up to 5,400. Caleb Martin's at 6K. I just have a difficult time on this slate where there are a lot of good plays that I want to get to. And there's even good plays that I'm not getting to, like Jaylen Brown, like Tyler Hero, that I really have a difficult time getting to. The Sixers. Toronto going into Milwaukee, another game where I will have a lot of exposure, but not on the Toronto side, and the field's not getting there either. You should have Emmanuel Quickley here. He obviously cuts into everyone's rates. RJ Barrett is up to $8,300. He was like $6,500 or something, I think, when he first came back before Quickley got hurt. So pretty much very, very difficult to get to Barrett at that salary, with assuming that Quickley is playing. So I have a little bit of Barrett. The field has a little bit, but other than that, nobody getting to the Raptors. The Milwaukee side is obviously the more interesting side here. No Damian Lillard, no Chris Middleton. Very good matchup going up against Toronto. 116 team total. The Raptors have the second worst adjusted defensive rating, tied for dead last, actually, with Atlanta so far this season. They have also played at a top 10 pace. So sets up really nicely here. Giannis, 1.88 DraftKings points per minute, if I remember correctly. I'm trying to pull that back up. I looked before the show. Without Lillard or Middleton on the floor since the start of last season. I think it's 1.88 DraftKings points per minute in the full games that he's played without Dame, and then like 1.7 or so just without them on the floor, but I am double checking that now. But one way or the other, massive ceiling for Giannis. 11,300 is a reasonable price tag, especially when you do have somebody like Keaton Wallace that you can go to at 3,200. You have Grayson Allen at sub 4K. You have Garrison Matthews sub 4K. You have plenty of other just relatively cheap guys that you can mix and match here and there that make it pretty easy to get to Giannis. So the field's getting to 55%. I have even more than that, just jamming him into lineups here. Looks really, really good in this matchup, and then also really, really good with Dame out along with Middleton. Taurean Prince getting 17% ownership. Ryan Rollins getting 11%. Brook Lopez getting 11%. I am getting a lot of Brook Lopez here. 5,500 is just a pretty good price tag. You could get a little bit more playing time just because Dame being out lowers the blowout risk here against the bad Toronto team. Only about an 8-point spread. We haven't seen much Lopez without Lillard this year. He's only played about 6 minutes without Lillard on the floor. But going back to last season, 549 minutes played, 0.92 DraftKings points per minute, 17.5% usage rate for Lopez. It's just a cheap price tag in a pretty good spot, and there is at least some additional upside, even if it's not on an average, median basis. You just have one less high usage guy out here. So if Lopez is playing well, there's one less guy taking shots away from him. So I'm getting to a lot of Lopez at modest ownership here. Taurean Prince, I think, looks fine as another value play at 4,100. A little bit below the field. Not a high upside guy. Not somebody I expect to take on a ton more usage without Dame, because that's not really his role. And then Ryan Rollins getting 11% ownership at 3K. I only have 2% right now. Maybe steps up and pays off that price. I guess if you're looking to get away from Wallace and stay in that price range, I guess you can go to Ryan Rollins. But for me, I am not getting to much of him. I don't really need to, since I'm getting to so much Keaton Wallace. Giannis, the very clear priority for me. Reginald Hall said Giannis will be a liability for your entire lineup. Giannis is the highest projected player on the slate by a lot. So if he sucks, it's going to be bad for a lot of people. If you generally go into NBA slates looking to avoid the highest projected player, you're probably going to lose a lot of money over the course of the season. So not really worried about Giannis here. Power said Q-tag downgrade for Ayton. That's not ideal for a 10 o'clock game. So that could open up some more value later. You could, I guess, take the approach of projecting him out. Obviously, I didn't do that for this show, and I'm not prepared for it other than kind of just talking about it on the fly. But that is a spot where with the midday downgrade, if you wanted to like bump Robert Williams or something, you could, and you would at least be somewhat different. You would have different builds. Obviously, in that case, you are screwed if Ayton ends up playing. But something to at least think about. Haven't gotten to that game yet, though. Phoenix here, I mentioned Grayson Allen earlier. 48% projected ownership right now at $3,700. No Kevin Durant here, so you should see increased playing time again for Allen. I understand the price tag. About a 24-minute projection makes sense here based on what we saw last game. He played about 26, 27 minutes in that one, but he played a few minutes in overtime, played about 24 minutes in regulation. He projects as a good value here. I think it's a very fragile play too, though, but there's volatility in both directions. So saying he's fragile isn't necessarily a bad thing. He's in 33% of my lineup, so a little bit below the field, but still a pretty big part of my night. It's tough to think that he plays a lot less than 24 minutes. You know, if Royce O'Neal's playing really well, or Ryan Dunn's playing really well, or both, or, you know, whatever it may be, you could maybe get like 20 minutes in some games. But if Grayson Allen's playing well, he also has a path to playing, you know, 26, 27, 28 minutes. So there is volatility here. If he were low owned, I would love that volatility because it gives him, you know, a bigger standard deviation. It gives him a high ceiling for the price tag. At this ownership, I think you do need to mention the downside as well, that you could just have Grayson Allen play 22, 23, 24 minutes, not do a ton, and half the field just has, you know, like a 20-point guy in their lineup. But overall, just is cheaper than he should be with no Kevin Durant at 3,700. So he does look like a good value here, and I'm getting a lot, even if it's a little bit below the field. Tyus Jones looks like a stand that I'm taking right now, which I'm perfectly fine with. I'm getting to 32%, field's at 15. So I'm basically 2x the field on a $5,400 Tyus Jones. No Kevin Durant just opens things up in this offense. Obviously, you expect most of the usage bump to be going to Devin Booker and to Bradley Beal, more so than Tyus Jones. But you did get a lot of playing time from Tyus Jones last game. Played about 36 minutes in regulation, 40 minutes including overtime. No guarantee that you get 36 minutes again, but the absence of Durant does make it more likely that Jones is in the closing lineup. When Durant is in, you, in theory, can get Devin Booker closing at point guard. It's less likely that that happens now. So it does make Tyus Jones' minute projection a little bit better with Durant being out. Devin Booker obviously is going to look really, really good with no Durant. 8,800, still a pretty cheap price tag at 88. Yeah, still pretty cheap price tag at 8,800 with Durant out. 36% projected ownership, 29% for me. So no real stand either direction, but obviously he looks good. Nurkic is questionable here. If he is out, you probably get a $4,400 Mason Plumlee as a good value. If he is in, he's still really risky. We've seen his playing time kind of jerked around this year, but he's also affordable at 5,800 and getting 15, 16% ownership, which is about where I think he should be. That is news that we are waiting on, though. Plumlee, a good point per minute guy. So he is certainly someone where if Nurkic is out, I think you can go to Plumlee pretty comfortably, assuming that he slides into the starting lineup. Jake said just play Klinging instead of Time Lord, if that fits. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have an actual take on the players. My point was more a backup center if you want to project Ayton out. But yeah, either one. Obviously, I haven't even really looked at that rotation because it didn't matter when the show started. Bradley Beal getting 22% ownership. I'm a little below the field at 11%. Again, Beal is perfectly fine. I'd throw him in that bucket with like Franz Wagner, Tyler Hero, Jaylen Brown, where if by lock I'm getting to more Bradley Beal, that's fine. But just with the way my lineup's broke right now, I'm not getting to a ton. I'm prioritizing Booker more. I'm using Allen as value. I'm getting to a lot of Tyus Jones, and it's just costing me some Bradley Beal, in addition to, you know, obviously guys that I'm playing from other teams. Royce O'Neal, Ryan Dunn, not a ton of interest in either one. Royce O'Neal getting 9% ownership. I assume he comes off the bench again. He very easily could be in the closing lineup. We saw him play through overtime last game and to close the game as well. Played about 23 minutes in regulation, 28 including overtime. You probably get around 24 minutes on average, but like I was saying with Grayson Allen. If O'Neal's playing well, you have a path to, upper 20s, and he is relatively inexpensive. Ryan Dunn, 3,500 is cheap, but not a very good point per minute guy. He's not out there to do things that produce a lot of fantasy points. He's out there, for defensive reasons mostly, and is relatively unlikely to close this game. I would anticipate that you're getting Grayson or O'Neal in that closing lineup, if not both of them. So not overly interested in him, even though he is really cheap and probably starting. On the Utah side, no Walker Kessler today does open up another really popular play that I'm getting a lot of in John Collins. $6,300 price tag is nice for Collins. He's a good point per minute guy. He always has been. The issue with him on Utah has really just been that his playing time is capped by Walker Kessler because they don't really like having Markkanen, Collins, and Kessler all on the floor at the same time. Played 29 minutes last game in a game where Kessler played 19. With Markkanen healthy, you pretty much get 48 minutes combined between Kessler and Collins. No Kessler today, though, should mean Collins moves into the starting lineup and plays as many minutes as John Collins can. So at a $6,300 price tag, that's going to make him look pretty good. 1.1 DraftKings points per minute for Collins since the start of last season. So I like getting to him quite a bit here. He also has power forward eligibility, which is really nice. We know that the opportunity cost is just higher at center typically than other positions because you can only roster 2 on DraftKings, 1 obviously on FanDuel. So being able to get him at power forward is really nice as well. I wouldn't be shocked if this ownership comes up a little bit, but I think it really should be higher. I'm getting to 40% right now. Lauri Markkanen, 17% ownership at 7,400. I'm a little above the field there. I think he looks fine as well. 36 minutes last game. We don't have any playing time concerns for him. So I like that. You have one of the tighter spreads on the slate, which is nice. So far this season, the Suns are middle of the pack in adjusted defensive rating. They are middle of the pack in pace. So pretty neutral matchup from that standpoint. Markkanen, obviously just a good player here. And then not really getting to much of anything else from Utah. Power said Tatum and Horford are in, which is nice. I didn't really want to deal with the Celtics without Tatum. So Celtics are what they were when I talked about them before. Obviously getting to any of the starters is fine. Jaylen Brown, the guy that I wish I were getting more of that I'm not. But yeah, nothing changing with Boston from what I already talked about. Now getting to that Portland game where we did get the DeAndre Ayton downgrade. Starting on the Minnesota side, Rudy Gobert is showing up for me a lot at 6,400, and I like this one at 12% ownership. I'm around 2x the field, and you're just talking about somebody that in competitive games typically plays a lot of minutes, played 32 and a half last game, but we've seen other games this year where he plays 34, 35 minutes. The Timberwolves are like 7 or 8 point favorites on the road, but I like the upside that Gobert offers at a pretty cheap price tag. If DeAndre Ayton is out, you could argue that, maybe a little bit easier time for Gobert getting rebounds, but probably not. Like, you're still going to have 2 competent defensive centers for Portland. But either way, I just like the price tag here on Gobert. Mike Conley right around the field at 13%. 4,200 is a really cheap price tag, assuming that he remains in the starting lineup. There was some talk from one of the Minnesota beat writers about Conley potentially moving to the bench, but I believe it was him suggesting that it would benefit Minnesota to move Conley to the bench, not him reporting that Minnesota might move Conley to the bench. So expecting around 24 minutes or so from Conley, assuming that he starts at 4,200 in this spot, just makes him a pretty good value play that I am right around the field on. DiVincenzo at 5,200 looks fine, likely to give you upper 20s in minutes. Played 29 last game, generally going to give you, 27, 28, 29 minutes. I think he looks fine at that price, pretty much correctly priced. Julius Randle at 7,700 has a nice ceiling, but again, I think that's just pretty much the correct price tag for him. You'll certainly get some big games from him this year, probably going to give you 33, 34 minutes in most competitive games. Played 36 last game, which is good to see, but pretty much priced where he should be. Same goes for Ant at 8,800. Getting 6% ownership, wouldn't fault anyone for going there. I already mentioned getting to a lot of LaMelo at 7% ownership. If you told me that Anthony Edwards is the guy that you want to play at sub 10% ownership and an $8,800 price tag, perfectly fine. I wouldn't push back on that. I wouldn't be upset if I started getting some Edwards instead of LaMelo, but just a high upside, low owned play. Naz Reid, Alexander Walker, McDaniels, all just viable secondary options that don't really look like priorities for me. Gobert, the guy that I'm getting to the most over the field on as well. Emmanuel Quickly apparently out, according to chat. Yep. miss at least a week. So that does kind of open things up for Toronto. I'll try and quickly talk about that. I don't think it's going to make things too interesting because prices have already adjusted. Like Barrett's still $8,300. It's $100 more than Jaylen Brown against the Hawks. Grady Dick's up to 6,500. Like they've played so many games without Quickly already that I don't necessarily think anything's going to end up looking like a priority here. I'm not super confident in that since I obviously haven't projected it or run anything with them out. But my immediate thought is probably that everybody's going to look a little bit better, but probably still not look great just because we've already played so many games without Quickly. You've already had time for that to adjust, for those prices to adjust rather. On the Portland side, not getting anything here. If Ayton is out, that certainly can change. Going back to their last game, you had Klingon play 17 minutes. You had Williams play 11. They played alongside each other, which is interesting. I assume they would both just play more if Ayton is out. Obviously, there's a limit on how much Williams can play. They are both $3,100, so you would get a pretty nice ceiling from one or both of those guys. If Ayton is out, that would certainly open up some pretty good value for you. It does also create the situation where going back to what I was saying before, where like I just used Robert Williams as the example of if you think Ayton's not going to play, you can project him higher. It is nice that they are the same salary because let's say you project Ayton out and you just have a bunch of Donovan Klingon, and then they for whatever reason say Robert Williams is starting. It's very easy to just replace him. They're the same salary, so that's nice. Williams does have power forward eligibility as well, which is cool. So that is a piece where you're going to want to be around to late swap, and I think that there is potentially an advantage to assuming Ayton doesn't play since we got the midday downgrade. The issue, again, is just that you are in really big trouble if he does play. The upside is if you could just build a bunch of lineups that have like the starting center for the Blazers at 3,100 instead of Keaton Wallace, for example, you could be in a really nice spot if news breaks your way. So something to consider, something to kind of weigh the pros and cons on and think about. But with Ayton projected in, I don't really see anything standing out for Portland. And then finally wrapping things up with Dallas going into Golden State. Luka is clearly your Giannis pivot if you are looking to go that route as far as pay up guys go. $11,000 price tag is $400 less than Giannis. Just does not project the same. Have about a 67-point projection on Giannis. Have about a 57-point projection on Luka. Luka is not facing the Hawks, and he is not playing without his highest scoring teammates. So just a completely different player, completely different projection. But in a one-game sample, obviously, Luka is capable of just scoring 70-plus fantasy points and beating Giannis. So he is, where I would look if I were trying to get away from Giannis. But as we've already talked about, I'm pretty much just jamming Giannis in, and I'm right around the field here on Luka. Not getting to much else from Dallas. Najee Marshall, 11% for the field at 4,600. I'm around 9%. Lively is questionable. If he's out, it will make Daniel Gafford look a little bit better. Gafford at 5,200 would become a pretty interesting play, but with Lively projected in, neither of them look all that appealing. I assume that you'll get back to the similar rotation that the Mavs were running prior to Lively's injury, where Gafford was starting and Lively was typically playing more minutes, although they were kind of just splitting it. Kyrie Irving, another high upside guy at 8,300. He is a really good example of somebody you could use as like a Devin Booker pivot in a specific lineup. Booker is $500 more. He's getting like 8 times the ownership. I like Booker more. I'm playing more Booker. Booker projects better, but in one lineup, if you need to save ownership, Kyrie obviously has a very, very high ceiling, as he showed last game. And then Klay Thompson, 10% ownership at 5,100, I think looks fine. I'm not really getting to him much, though. Bob Johnson said it's a competitive game, though. Bucks could blow out the Hawks. Yeah, they're and I said Atlanta. I meant to say Toronto. Same difference. They could blow out Toronto. They're also only 8-point favorites, so it's not a huge spread. But also something to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about blowouts is generally you shouldn't be as worried about the team that is favored, because there are exceptions where, in this case, let's just say Milwaukee plays great defense and Toronto just doesn't score enough points to keep up with an average offensive output. That happens sometimes, but more often than not, your players on the team that are doing the blowing out produce at a very, very high rate if they blow a team out to the point where they lose, 5-6 minutes down the stretch. So it's frustrating, and you remember it because like Giannis has 68 fantasy points after 3 and then doesn't play anymore, but he still has 68 fantasy points in 24 minutes or whatever. So I generally don't worry about it as much when you're talking about the team that is favored as the team that is the underdog, where if those guys lose minutes, they probably also weren't producing at an above average rate. The guys on the Bucks, at least some of them, probably produced at an above average rate. And then also, yeah, good point from Anthony too, point differential for the in-season tournament. So there is incentive for these guys to play a little bit deeper into the game as well. Eubanks, people are asking about. I'm not getting to him. Don't have a great projection on him. I assume he just backs up John Collins here. So I think he's like your prototypical backup center, where if you want to hope that like John Collins gets in foul trouble or Eubanks plays really well or something like that, he's not going to be popular most likely. And that, there's a path for him to do well. He's a 0.88 DraftKings point per minute guy. So he's not as good a point per minute guy as most backup centers are. Guys like Jalen Smith that I like playing at cheap price tags because he's like 1.1 or so fantasy points per minute. So you do need a little bit more playing time from Eubanks than you would somebody like that. But it is that type of play. It's just not a slate where I think I really need a whole lot of that because there's value elsewhere. And I don't really want to burn the center position all that much. There are centers I like on this slate. So I'm not really getting to Eubanks. I assume, again, that he's just backing up John Collins here. I assume if John Collins plays 32 minutes, Eubanks plays 16 or something like that. And then finally wrapping things up here with Golden State. They said that they want to use the same starting lineup that they did last game, which gives us the Anthony Melton as another quality value play here. $4,200 price tag showing up in 33% of my lineups. Had a huge game against Oklahoma City last time out. You're obviously not expecting him to replicate that, but he is a pretty good point per minute guy, has been throughout his career, played 27 minutes in that one. So at 4,200, there is clearly still value here. Projects for about 25 DraftKings points. Happy to get to him. Andrew Wiggins is questionable with, I believe, a back injury. If he's in, 5,300 is a pretty nice price tag there. Played 35 minutes last game. If he's in, I assume he's just good to go. There is, some risk that he, I guess, plays limited minutes, but if he's in, I assume he's good to go. And Wiggins looks pretty good at 5,300. If he's out, it opens up more minutes for other guys. The issue is that Steve Kerr, historically, when somebody like Wiggins is out, uses multiple people to replace his minutes. It's usually not just a plug and play where he throws one guy into a bunch of minutes. So that kind of limits, exactly how excited you can get about other pieces on Golden State. But I assume you would be getting like more playing time for Podziemski potentially, maybe Moody. Don't really know where Kerr would go with the starting lineup, but it would open up guys that you can at least roll the dice on. If he's in, though, I do like Wiggins at this price. Steph looks good at 8,300, just a cheap price tag for what Steph can do. We saw it last time out where he had, I think, like 60 DraftKings points. Obviously, always gives you that kind of ceiling. He's somebody that typically for me in DFS, I don't play a lot of because he used to be priced like a superstar. And for a, 10K guy, he's pretty one-dimensional. But for an $8,300 guy, this is somebody that has a very, very high ceiling and projects pretty well. So I like Melton a lot as a value play. I like Wiggins. I like Steph. Draymond, Kuminga, I think both kind of just like last guy in type pieces. But Melton looks like the priority. Wiggins and Curry, secondary options at their respective salaries. So they look pretty good. Neil said, this slate is fun as hell, IMO. Haven't figured out what I'm doing yet, but tons of moving parts. I'm not 100% sure if he's talking for himself or if he is making fun of the fact that we've had news break on the show and it's making me not really know what I'm doing. I assume he was speaking for himself, but either way, he would be right. It does look like a pretty fun slate. I think that I like slates like this where there are some pretty clear-cut plays that I can get to. I would prefer if they were a little bit better than somebody like Keaton Wallace, but also where there are kind of some like mid-range pivots you can make where like Devin Booker is obviously a really good play, but you can also play lower owned Steph or LaMelo or Edwards or anybody else. Kyrie is the one that I was trying to think of. So I think it looks like a pretty fun slate. To recap right now, if the slate started right now, building around Keaton Wallace as a value play, even though I absolutely hate it, building around Giannis, which obviously is going to feel really good. John Collins, I like a lot, especially with power forward eligibility. Brook Lopez, I'm fine at this price tag getting to him in a good matchup. I wouldn't be super upset if he kind of disappeared a little bit because he's not somebody that I expect to get a huge bump without Dame. So I think it is just kind of more driven by the matchup, price tag, lack of ownership. Grayson Allen, relatively volatile minutes, but also just a really cheap price tag. Anthony Melton looks like one of the better values today. Have a nice stand on Tyus Jones right now, getting to a lot of Booker, 2x on Gobert, 2x on Daniels, around the field on Batadze. So you can kind of see here, I'm not going super crazy on low-owned guys. I have a nice stand here on LaMelo as well, but do have some nice 2 to 3x stands on guys around 10%, and then, getting some of these chalkier guys as well. As far as the most popular guys that I'm not getting to, I'm under on Allen and Booker, but not by a huge margin. Half the field on Beal. Again, I think he's a good play. I just have some other priorities. So there's no huge fades for me amongst the most popular plays right now. Usually in NBA DFS, there aren't going to be, with some exceptions. But just because it is a more projectable sport, usually I'm not going to have any really big fades on top end guys because they usually are popular for good reasons. Goomba said Cade at same price as Booker is a great play. Yeah, sure. With all of those guys, you're basically just doing the same thing as I'm doing with LaMelo and just saying, look, this guy's really, really good. The field's not playing him. I will take a big ownership discount, hope that he beats that range, beats Devin Booker. Obviously, we're talking about this in the context of a pivot off Booker. It applies to any chalk play. But also the thing you have to keep in mind too is it's not a 1-to-1 because you do actually need Cunningham or Edwards or LaMelo or whoever it is to beat that entire range. If my LaMelo play beats Devin Booker, great. But if Anthony Edwards beats LaMelo, it's still useless that I played a bunch of LaMelo. So unless I have him, with Edwards. So it is still, needing those guys to beat the entire range. And I want to, point that out since we're talking about it in more of a 1v1 context. But yeah, Cade Cunningham absolutely fits that same mold of guys where he's low owned because he doesn't project as well. His team has a relatively low total. The matchup's not super appealing, but in a 1-game sample, his ceiling is just as high as Anthony Edwards or any of these guys. He can go for 60 fantasy points just like they all can. So perfect example there as well. So that wraps this one up. Don't forget to keep an eye out on news between now and lock. Hopefully we get some sort of information on DeAndre Ayton. Again, pretty interesting risk reward situation there. I don't really have a good solution. So the other problem here with Ayton, just to kind of talk this through for a second, because I've been trying to think about it as I talk. I'm getting to Minnesota, but it's relatively expensive guys with the exception of Conley. I'm not getting to any Portland, not getting to a lot of Dallas, getting some Golden State. There's no real clear-cut plan, I don't think, if DeAndre Ayton played. If you project DeAndre Ayton out and then you find out at 9 o'clock that he's playing, I don't think there's a super clear-cut plan. If you find out before 9 o'clock, you can probably turn some of it into Drew Eubanks, which isn't ideal, but it's not the end of the world. But if you find out at 9:01, I really don't know what you do other than hope that Ayton gets hurt during the game and keep whichever of the centers you played, because I don't think it's likely you're going to have a lot of lineups, at least I'm not, that have multiple spots open in these last 2 games. I don't like any of the last 2 games enough to force multiple spots to be open. So it adds to the risk here that you're not going to have really easy swaps. If you had the Milwaukee game starting at 10 p.m. along with these two, you could more comfortably project Ayton out because then you can just swap to Ryan Rollins or something and still be live. So, yeah, pretty interesting spot there. I'm going to think about it more. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do. I would suggest you guys do the same. At the very least, be ready to late swap if Ayton is out. That's probably the approach that I'll take. That's generally the way that I go, but is interesting to think about, especially just because you have so much ownership going into Keaton Wallace. It's pretty easy to think about or to see how potentially it pays off really well if Keaton Wallace scores 20 fantasy points and then you are just sitting here with a starting center for Portland at the same price. But very, very risky also. So that wraps this one up. Thank you for checking it out. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. Also, forgot to mention it during the show. Check out Endgame Syndicate if you haven't already. Link is in the description below. Our monthly roundtable is tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 Eastern. So if you are already a member, get your questions in Discord. If you are not, now's a good time to sign up. Get your questions answered by Utical, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. I will also be back doing this show tomorrow at 4:30. I will see you all then.